Hey, good afternoon. Some would say Moadim L'Simcha, which means may it be holidays for joy, or Aguten Moyed, because although it's not the holiday, that's why I am on Facebook Live, but it is Chol HaMoed, which is the intermediate days of the holiday, which has special obligations of celebration too, and we blessed the Lulav and Etrog, and we still eat in a Sukkah, and we had long services today, we read the Torah, etc., etc. But the truth is, and I'm sitting, of course, in our Sukkah, the weather is beautiful, I'm celebrating in God's shade and God's protection. But it's one of the most, out of all the holidays that the Jewish people have, Sukkot is the most ironic holiday. We leave our beautiful homes, our secure homes that protect us from rain, from winds, from hurricanes, from snow, and we go into temporary huts. We leave our security and we go into a vulnerable place, which is the Sukkah. And the truth is that in Jewish law, there's a whole discussion why we sit in a Sukkah. And the reason is because, as we read yesterday in the Torah, God says that we should sit in a Sukkah for 7 days. Why? That our generation should know. Because Basukot Hoshafti et Bnei Yisrael, I gave the Jewish people, I put them at the Sukkot, and that's where they sat, and that's why I want you to remember that. And there's an argument in the Talmud, like every good thing in Judaism. What does it mean that the Jews sat in a Sukkah? Rabbi Eliezer, one of the greatest rabbis, says very simple. I don't know if you studied the Bible, but if you did, you know that when the Jews traveled in the desert, they had the clouds of glory protecting them the whole time. So it protected them from the sun, from the rain, from the snakes, from the scorpions, from everything. So basically, Rabbi Eliezer says God made a great miracle. He made the clouds of glory protect the Jewish people the whole time, and therefore we remember that great miracle and we celebrate it. Comes along Rabbi Akiva. Oh, you all heard, one of the greatest sages that lived. Someone who only learned how to study Torah at the age of 40, but is someone so memorable, we quote him more than anyone else in the Torah. And he says, no, Sukkah doesn't mean a cloud of glory. We never hear it quoted that way. Sukkah means literally a hut. And in fact, for 40 years, the Jews traveled in the desert. Where did they sleep? In little huts. And every time they moved, they picked themselves up, they took their huts, they moved it to the next place. And that's why we celebrate Sukkot. But the question is puzzling. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, what's he trying to say? Because we lived in huts for 7 days, that's what we're celebrating? That's a miracle? I mean, Passover, we celebrate getting rid of Pharaoh, the greatest villain, and being able to leave slavery. Shavuot, we celebrate receiving the Torah, the greatest gift that God gave us. And what do we celebrate? Sukkot, living in huts? Many people live in huts. In fact, you go to Israel today, many of the Bedouins still live in huts. You go around the world, people live in huts. What's the celebration of living in a hut? And what's even more puzzling is that, you know, that when we celebrate Sukkot in the services, we say Zman Simchaseinu, the time of joy. It's actually the only holiday that we say that, not Passover, not Shavuot. And the reason is because in the biblical reading that we read, God says 3 times you have to be joyous. So that's what we're joyous about living in huts for 40 years, traveling from place to place in huts. And Passover, we're not as joyous. And Shavuot, we're not as joyous. Only Sukkot. And the answer is a very profound one. You know, there's a Yiddish song we sing that goes, Sukkah La'Kleina. And it speaks about this young girl who comes into the Sukkah. They live in Eastern Europe or in Russia, and it's cold and it's windy, and the winds are blowing and the rain is starting to come. It might even be snow. And the girl comes crying to her daddy. She says, Daddy, you're so engrossed in your studying the Sukkah, but the candles are about to blow out. The candles are blown out already, and the Sukkah walls are going to fall. The Sukkah's going to fall. And the father turns to the little young daughter and he says, don't worry, my Zisa Kindle, my beautiful daughter. The Sukkah has stood for 2,000 years through winds and hurricanes. The Sukkah won't fall down. And it's really a metaphor for Judaism. Sometimes we worry, what's with the future of Judaism? The winds of the Sukkah are blowing. Is it going to continue to blow? Is it going to fall down? And the answer the Father gives us is, look what the history has taught us. For 2,000 years, we thought our Sukkah was falling, but it never fell. Well, Rabbi Akiva is saying like this, that the greatest miracle is much greater than what Rabbi Eliezer said. It's great to have the clouds of glory, but when you travel in huts for 40 years, and you feel vulnerable, and you don't know which direction you're going to. And many times the Jews were in the desert, they thought they got lost, they thought they were gone forever. Yet at the end, you arrive, where do you arrive? In the promised land. After all those struggles and obstacles, you arrive in the promised land. You know, when someone loses their hope, you think about Corona and all the struggles that people have had, and the uncertainty and the insecurity. And when you lose your foundation, you have nothing to lean on, and you grasp something to lean on for hope. And it's at that moment that Rabbi Akiva is telling us that we have to recognize and understand that God is the one who's driving the car, and God is the one who's in control. And even though it looks vulnerable and shaky, at the end of the day, as the Jewish people realized after 40 years, you arrive in the promised land. It's like a kid being in an amusement park, and they go on the scariest roller coasters, and it has 250 feet drops, and they're going upside down and sideways, and the kids aren't scared, they're screaming from joy. Well, they're not scared, you know why? Because they know that there's someone conducting it. And the same thing is with our life. Rabbi Akiva is saying the greatest miracle that we really celebrate is that within that vulnerability, we know and we're confident the whole time that who's riding the roller coaster, who's controlling the roller coaster? It's God. You know, my friend told me that right after the beginning of COVID, he ended up in the Uber, and he saw a funny thing. He was in the driver's car, and he saw that the driver had a second on the passenger front seat. There was another steering wheel, and he says to the driver, "What's the steering wheel?" And the driver said, "Listen, I have a young kid, and the kid makes me crazy. He always wants to drive. I can't let him drive the car. So I put in a second steering wheel, and he turns it. And when he turns it, he thinks he's driving the car, and he makes believe, and I'm driving the car, but he thinks he's driving the car." And the metaphor is so powerful. The same things with our lives. We think we're in control. We think we're driving the car, but who's really driving the car? It's Hashem. And if you look at chapter 27 of Psalms that we say the entire time from the beginning of Elul through the end of Sukkot, we say Hashem Ori V'Yishi. God is my light which goes on Rosh Hashanah. V'Yishi is my salvation, or forgive me goes on Yom Kippur. And then we say Ki Yitzpineni B'Sukkah. God will protect me in a sukkah. It's that protection that we get from God that we celebrate on Sukkot. It's the greatest miracle. You see, 150 years ago in Europe, in Germany, Berlin, the mayor came to celebrate Passover in the chief rabbi's home, and he saw the kids ask the 4 questions. And after the kids asked the 4 questions, he turned to the rabbi and says, "I don't understand. Why is the kid asking the 4 questions now? Your home is set up so beautifully. There's gold, there's silver, there's delicious food, there's brisket. It's warm, it's safe here. Really, you should ask it on Sukkot when you're sitting in these huts. And then you should ask, why is this night different than all other nights?" And the rabbi answered him with the sad irony, and he said, "You know, for us Jews, the Sukkah, that's not a question. Why is this night different than others? We're used to that. We felt vulnerable. We felt misplaced. We felt like we're living in huts so many times through our history. But it's when we sit in our home and we're comfortable and we're in luxurious times and we're celebrating like kings, that's when the kid asks, why is this night different than others?" And that's what Rabbi Akiva is teaching us, that the true joy of a Jew, the greatest joy, the greatest simcha is on Sukkot. Because when we recognize that in our greatest vulnerability, in our crisis of COVID, in our crisis of insecurity, when we don't have the things we are used to, at that moment we figure out and we remember who is driving us. It's God. Who's in charge? It's Hashem. Where are we going to end up? In the promised land. And we throw our trust in Hashem, as we say in the end of benching, Baruch HaGever, Asher Yiftach B'Hashem. Great is the man, the woman, who puts their trust in Hashem. And I want to finish with this story. In New York, there's a great rabbi. His name is Rabbi Fisher Schachter. And he says an amazing story about this woman, survivor of the Holocaust. Terrible tragedy. She remembers she was a teenager during the Holocaust, and she remembers the way her parents would hide every day as they were trying to stay safe from the Nazis. And their parents had a passage under the house, a hiding place, where they would move the furniture, pull open the rug, and the door would come open, and they would go under, and then they would cover it, and they would hide every time the Nazis came searching. And she, being the teenager, was in charge of doing that. And she did that every time the family would run under. She would move the furniture back, she would roll the carpet, she would climb up on top somewhere and hide. And that's what would happen. And she would watch the Nazis come and ransack their home. And they never found them until, unfortunately, the time came. And they pulled away her family as she watched. And her whole family perished. And she herself went through the camps. And she came out and she moved to America. And she moved to Manhattan. And she married a lovely Jewish man. And for 12 years they tried to have children, but they couldn't have children. And it was terrible for her. One time she went to see one of the greatest specialists on fertility, and Dr. checked her and looked at all her records and says, "Ma'am, there's nothing we can do. You're not going to have children." He says, "I want to tell you something. I don't want you to waste any more of your time, but you'll have children when I'll be able to grow hair on my palm of my hand." The woman left devastated. What kind of life did she have? She survived the Holocaust. She survived being an experiment of Mengele, and that's why she couldn't have children. And what life did she have if she can't have children? She gets onto the bus to go back home, and she's sobbing. She breaks down. She's devastated. And she's crying, and she passes her stop. The next stop, she doesn't want to get off. Where's she going? What's she going to go home for? What's she going to tell her husband? How's she going to continue living? And this goes on till the bus comes to its final stop. Everyone's off. She's sitting in the back crying. And finally, the bus driver parks the bus and comes down and says, "Excuse me, ma'am. I have to park the bus. I got to get home. You need to get off the bus." And she says, "I have nowhere to go. I have no interest in getting off." He says, "Listen, I'm sorry, but I need to park the bus. I can go to my family." And then he says to her, "By the way, I don't know what your problem is, but you're not going to solve it by staying on the bus. That's not how you're going to solve it." And she realized at that moment that as sad as her life was, and as challenging and as struggling as it was, he was right. She had to go on. She had to continue living. She had to have faith in God, and she had to continue her life. And Hashem will figure out a way. And miraculously, she went home, and a year later, she had a child. And today, this woman has many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And Rabbi Schachter says, I know the story personally, because I know the woman, and I heard the story for her many, many, many times. Because this woman is my mother. Rabbi Schachter himself was blessed to give this woman 14 children and many countless grandchildren. And that is the story. The David Hashem Oidi V'Yishi, Ki Yitzbeneni B'Sukkah. God protects us in the shade. And it's our job to recognize who's driving the Uber. We might have a second steering wheel, but ultimately the one who's driving the Uber is God. And Rabbi Akiva's message that he tries to deliver us so poignantly is that, listen, the greatest miracle is not that we're in the clouds of glory and we're protected from the shade and we're so secure and we feel no vulnerability and no crisis. That's not the greatest miracle. The greatest miracle is when we live in huts and we're transplanted from place to place and we have to move them constantly. And 40 years, we're just wandering Jews like we've been for the last 2,000 years. But at the end, we come to the promised land. And as the Yiddish song says, the Sukkah that came on Shvala. The Sukkah's been standing for 2,000 years. It's going to continue standing. Let us throw our faith and trust in the Almighty, and let Him bless each and every one of us with the most joyous and celebratory Sukkahs, because true joy only comes when we're able to throw our trust in the Almighty and recognize that He's in charge. And through all the vulnerability and turmoil and ups and downs and going upside down, it's Hashem that runs the world, and it's Hashem that guides over our life. And when we do that, and we throw our trust in Him, we can have true joy. We have internal joy, inner joy, that infuses our life and our family and our surroundings, and we're able to celebrate true joy that becomes revealed good for us and our families. Chag Sameach, Moadim L'Simcha, a Guten Moed.